Well, I'm here today with Martin Japtok. Really grateful for your time, and we were hoping to have a conversation about um, how white people can most positively contribute to what is happening right now in this country. And maybe, Martin, you could just sort of introduce yourself first before we get going on the conversation.
Right, so my name is Martin Japtok, and so I'm German, just to get that out of the way. And so I've been teaching classes for, 25 years or something, about various classes in African American studies, multicultural studies, and English classes with a focus like that also, often dealing with questions of race and ethnicity and identity and questions of that sort. And that's sort of my area of study and also scholarship. So I've also published a number of books, on mostly about African American literature, but usually focused on questions of that sort. So that's my background.
Hey, thanks, Martin. So what would you say is the value of having two white men have a conversation about how they can contribute as white people to what's happening right now?
Well, I mean, on a kind of most obvious level, one could say, so if racism is a problem, then whose problem is it, right? So, and there's two ways, of course, to think about it in those terms. Namely, well, where does it originate and who's suffering from it? Right? And then the second question then would be, well, if one recognizes it as a problem, well, whose responsibility is it then to deal with it, right? And on that logic, I mean, it's going to have to be the responsibility of the perpetrator to deal with the problem more than it has to be that of the recipients. And ironically, historically, most often, of course, we've thought of kind of the problems of racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression as somehow the problem of the victim to deal with, and as the issue of the victim to solve. But that's, of course, mostly because typically perpetrators get something out of such systems of oppression. That's why they exist in the first place, right? So often I think we're sort of taught to think about racism essentially as a form of sadism, right? Like if white people could just be nicer, then everything would be all right, And then we don't ask at all, well, where did racism come from in the first place? What's its function? Why is it there? And of course, it's been there because it's gotten a particular group of people, in this case, white people, it's gotten them something. It's gotten them kind of material benefits, it's gotten them, well, psychological, quote unquote, benefits, the kind of the feeling of being superior under any circumstances, right? And so on and so forth. That's why it exists. That's why it continues to exist, right? And so, I mean, that's really on us to deal with, so we can't then wave the hand and say, well, you deal with that. That is your problem. No, I mean, it's our problem.
And I mean, one of the first ways a lot of white folks get stuck on this conversation is they think, well, I'm a nice person. I'm not racist. I'm not a perpetrator. And I haven't benefited in all these sort of ways you're talking about. What is my sort of, I get it that there's racism, but what is my individual responsibility in this? Like, what would you say to that kind of, and I know some of that's like takes years, right, of like self-awareness and growth, but are there any ways that you found that are helpful in helping people kind of learn more about white privilege and how they've benefited from it?
Yeah, that's actually, I think, some of the toughest stuff there is that, I mean, typically, and it's a normal reaction, right? Most of us, most of the time when we sort of get confronted with something, I mean, there's like two instant reactions, like guilt and defensiveness, and sometimes both, right? And most people react like that. I mean, we only have to ask ourselves, how do we deal with these things in our own relationships even, right? So typically, no, and you get defensive, and then 15 minutes later, you think, like, well, maybe there was a point to it, and then you come back, it's like, I think you were right after all, maybe I shouldn't, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So No, but so in this case, it's just magnified by 100, that kind of reaction, right? And that's often the most difficult hurdle, I think, to overcome in kind of an honest self-examinations about systems of racism. How does one overcome, on the one hand, the guilt, so on the other hand, the defensiveness, right? So, I mean, the guilt part, well, guilt can be productive, right? But it can also be paralyzing sometimes. The fact is, I mean, none of us choose into what skin we were born. Like we were born, it just so happens that we're not born into a vacuum. I didn't choose to be born white, and then I'm even called white. It's kind of ridiculous to begin with. I mean, right, this is white. So, I mean, even on a Zoom camera, right, there's still a whopping difference between the two. So, so I didn't choose that, right? So, but of course, we'd never choose our position. I didn't choose. One doesn't choose to be born poor or into a wealthy household. And then the question comes, okay, but what does that mean that I'm born into that position? And at that point, of course, then it's not innocent any longer. And then I have to sort of confront what are the ramifications of that.
Especially once we start enjoying the benefits of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's taken me a long time to realize, for a lot of white people, the benefits, it's easy to assume because we're sort of the racial norm that it's harder to see the water that we swim in sometimes. So it's taken me a long time to see, even in small ways. I remember being so surprised to hear that many people of color feel like they're being watched and suspected of just kind of walking through stores, that they might shoplift, or that's something that never crossed my mind in my entire life, or how few times I've been pulled over driving. And one time I got pulled over on my 21st birthday in one of the wealthiest suburbs in the Bay Area at like midnight. And I mean, I can't imagine what would have happened if I wasn't white. I ended up getting off without even a ticket in that case. And another way, I think it took me a long time growing up in San Diego. I love this sort of informal culture of, referring to everyone by their first name and always wearing shorts and flip-flops and just kind of looking like a slob in general. And it took me a long time to realize that the formality in terms of using titles and dressing up was something that I didn't have to kind of adhere to, because I expected people to take me seriously just because of who I was, not recognizing that a lot of that had to do with my skin color. So it's kind of a lifelong process for me to continue to learn how many ways that I benefit every day by my skin color without even knowing it.
Yeah, and that's where the humility part that comes with the guilt is actually useful, where then one has to, it's difficult. Yesterday I was listening to the sermon by Archbishop Michael Curry, and of course he was mentioning that that virtually every evil in the world ultimately sort of results from some degree of selfishness, sort of putting the self first and before others. And of course we so often do that when we kind of look out at the world, where we then think our experience is everybody else's experience too, and in terms of race, gender, and other identity categories, that's very much true. And one needs then the humility then to recognize also, well, no, my experience of the world is not everybody's experiences of the world. And just because I haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, that nobody else has experienced it. And I've had kind of moments like that too. I remember like so maybe 5 years ago or something, sometime like that, I was like after class talking to a group of students, some 4 or 5 students, and then and it turned out then that within the last 6 months, so 5 of the 6 of us had been stopped by the police, right? I was the only one who hadn't. Guess who the other students were, right? I mean, they were all African American men, of varying age ranges. One was in the 60s and was walking with a cane, and had all been stopped by the police randomly, not for anything they'd done, just randomly, like walking, sitting, whatever it might have been, right? So, well, I don't experience that, and so that, but then I have to then also take seriously when others say, well, yes, but I have experienced that, so that thing is real, and you're just going to have to accept that it's real, rather than to continually be in denial and say, well, no, but that's not the way it is, right? And so, and police would never do that. They're always nice to me, and what have you, right? And I think that's a hurdle, that people have to learn to jump over.
Yeah. But let's say I do have
experiences.
Yeah, let's say I do have a better sense of, the ways I've benefited from white privilege, and I'm now wanting to do more. I'm wanting to learn more about racism, my part in it, what I can do to more positively contribute to its eradication. What's the next step, and whose responsibility is it to educate me about my whiteness and social power and racism?
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, but I have to say I'm in a minority position in that. Like, in some sense, I think it's unfortunate that the term has become privileged to think about these things. I think the rhetoric of rights or human rights in many ways would maybe be more helpful, because that we've come to think of this in terms of privilege. Then, well, privilege is something that some people have and others don't. It's somehow seen as an additive. But then when people say, well, but I like this privilege, so I want to keep it. So then it makes people defend it, actually, right? So, but whereas I think of it in terms of rights, when I'm saying, now, of course, and in some sense, there are instances where the privilege is the right word, I believe. But many of those things that we often think of as white privilege, like not being followed around in a store, for example, well, that is a right. Everybody should have that right, right? Also, being able to rent a place without thinking that, well, they might not rent that to me based on my skin color, right? Or applying to a job and thinking, well, I should be judged by my merit, and it doesn't even occur to me that some of my color might play a role in whether I get that job or not. I think all of that, those are rights. And if we think of them as such, then it's not a zero-sum game, right? Because then we can say, well, I want everybody to have that, and I'm willing to fight for everybody to have that. Mm-hmm. But if we think of it in terms of privilege, and some people start thinking, well, somebody wants to take something away from me, and it puts them instantly in that defensive position, right? Because it's not a zero-sum game, right? So I don't lose by somebody else not being followed around in a store, right? Or not being, so I mean, I should want that if I like it, then I should want it for everyone. Right?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction. I'm trying to think of examples in which it is more of a zero-sum game. But there's more that I can think of that are more like rights than privileges. So
yeah, though sometimes economically, of course, sometimes it is a zero-sum game, and that's of course where often backlash comes from, right? Mm. If I'm white and I'm applying for a job, and whatever, let's say 50% of the applicants are white, and the other 50% are Hispanic, African American, Asian American, what have you. So, well, if in a system in which racism is normative, then I know my whiteness does confer immediate economic benefits. It doesn't automatically get me the job, but it might halve my competition. It might boost my likelihood of getting the job 100% in that particular example, right? So in those cases, one can, I think, talk about it as a sort of a privilege and unearned privilege. Mm-hmm. But in other instances, though, I mean, we're talking simply human rights, and of course, in that case too, because it's a human right not to experience job discrimination, but where people live, what kind of jobs they get, and so there are real economic benefits at stake. And that explains also some of the backlash we're experiencing currently, where, and let's face it, white people are going to be a minority in this country. Within in California, they have been for quite some time, where then some people are worried that somehow what they've seen as their entitlements, are going to be starting to slip away.
Yeah. What would you say is the appropriate role for white folks in the struggle to dismantle racism?
That kind of stuff gets tricky, right? I mean, first of all, we do have to engage in self-education. That's not to say that human relations shouldn't play a big role in that, but that's not something we can burden our black and brown and what have you friends with and say, hey, like, I'd like to understand this, can you tell me? So, like, not that there's no role in that, but then that would be sort of almost like a double whammy, right? So on the one hand, and people are experiencing the burden of racism, and now on top of it, it's their job to sort of educate other people about racism. Now, it's not to say that that can't play a role, but I think there has to be sort of like a gesture first, right? I mean, like that can't be my first step, right? That I'm going to, I'd like to understand this. Can you explain this to me, right? It's also not that every person of color is an instant expert on somehow then laying out systems of privilege and so on and so forth, right? So even though they have made those experiences, so we have to educate ourselves. And the fortunate thing is that there's no lack of material to start that process.
What would be the one thing I should read if I wanted to start?
Well, it depends on what level one should start. But these days I've come to think if there's one book I'd read, but it's not an easy book, it would be actually this one. So I've anticipated that question. So
The racial, what's it say?
The Racial Contract. Let me open it to a page where I can read it more easily.
Yeah.
The Racial Contract by Charles W. Mills.
Okay.
Now, the hurdle there, it is a book of political philosophy. On the other hand, it's very thin. It's like 130 pages.
Nice. Yeah.
It is dense reading, right? I mean, it's not like it's 130 pages, but one doesn't read that in a night. One reads like 5, 6, 7 pages at a time because one has to read it slowly.
Yeah.
But it is very comprehensive, right? I mean, sort of it lays out, what that actually means, that it shows how there's really no area of life that is not impacted by race and questions of race. I mean, none, literally. And it describes, and that's a hard thing to wrap one's mind fully around. But that book addresses all those questions, how even our spatial arrangements, how we move in space, and with what kind of confidence, and where we live, how and what we eat. I mean, all those things, what we eat and so on and so forth, how we interact with one another, how all of that, and our notions of freedom, and where they derive from, they're all implicated in questions of race.
Okay,
and how, for example, he starts out by saying how the often vaunted political theorists with whom we credit the systems of democracy and so on and so forth, most of them are also racial theorists of the worst kind, right? I mean, John Locke famously, for example, defined freedom as having property in one's own person. Now, that's a very weird definition of freedom. And of course, it has slavery written all over it, and it's then relevant to know that John Locke actually owned shares in slave ships. and yet he's sort of one of the political theorists who we sort of credit with a system that guarantees freedom for everybody and equal rights and so on and so forth. So the thing is, now it doesn't mean, you know, that these thoughts, we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater there either, right? So that some of these theoretical systems might still have their value and so on and so forth. But the book sort of lays out how you can sort of arbitrarily separate out questions of race. Sort of an unfortunate side story in the history of the Western world. No, it's part and parcel of the Western world, of how we live, of how our lives are organized, of how we think about everything. So it's a very powerful book, but it takes some time to digest. And
yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, other things, of course. Now, I'm in literature, right, and I'm a big believer in the power of imagination, both for good and bad. And sometimes literature can be an easier way in, right? Because literature is sort of the next best thing that we get to experience the world through somebody else's eyes, you know, and to walk in somebody else's shoes. And you end up, whether you want it or not, you get sort of sucked into the narrative, and you see the world through that protagonist's eyes, or in an autobiography through that person's eyes. And it can be very, very instructive, right?
Do you have another book suggestion that's laying on your desk that you're going to pull up for us?
Oh no, there's so many, you know. So there's
one. What's the first one?
Especially the history of especially African American autobiography is such a long and rich one, you know. So from Richard Wright's autobiography Black Boy, so to the classics, even the more Malcolm X of Malcolm X, right? To Warriors Don't Cry, which was by see, that's a problem. Like once I'm supposed to spew names out there, then someone's like,
I'm sorry.
So Warriors Don't Cry by Patio Beals, Melba Patio Beals, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, actually. So she went to Little Rock High School. So that one is a powerful one also. Very disturbing, actually.
Yeah.
But also I'd recommend just starting to read, and really, I'd do it randomly. Just read also I would recommend for people to read African American fiction, you know, so which then doesn't all deal, it shows also Black life, and so do the autobiographies, Black life in its fullness, because we shouldn't think of Black culture and Black life as always and only trauma. That's a big mistake too, you know. It's an incredibly rich culture, African American culture. That's always been my attraction to it, even when I was in Germany. So it's an incredibly rich culture, and so by reading the fiction, also it gives one sort of an inroad and some insight and learning to see the world from another perspective. Right? When you think about it, the great works of literature, they're almost always some form of dissident literature, right? Dostoevsky, that was Russian dissident literature, like Victor Hugo, that was French dissident literature, you know, Charles Dickens, that was British dissident literature, you know, where they looked at fault lines in their society and wrote some of the greatest kind of works of world literature that we know of. And the same is true with African American fiction. It's sort of written from a particular point of view of American society, and actually a very central point of view, and it provides new and enriching insights into it. And I always want to encourage people to read that, because it's going to enrich your world. It will broaden your world. It will make it richer. It will make it more complicated, but in the best of ways.
No, I love that idea that maybe one of the ways to prepare for really building relationships across racial lines is to first prepare ourselves by reading not only kind of biography and autobiography, but fiction, to be able to start to put ourselves in others' shoes and to imagine that experience from there.
Yeah, and it's on top of it, it's even pleasurable, right? I mean, like it's you give books like people don't regret having read good books, right? So it's very an enriching experience.
Mhm.
So if anybody wants a longer reading list, I'd be glad to compile one. Right?
Sure you could. Hey, one thing I feel stuck on right now in terms of thinking about appropriate white roles during what has been happening in this country. I feel like obviously, to be silent during this time, if you're anyone, is in its own way to sort of condone what's happening in terms of like police brutality, continued injustices in our systems that are supposed to be providing justice for all people. So if we're silent, we're condoning it. But then I also worry as a white male and privileged in so many ways that then when I speak out, I'm just doing the kind of privileged white guy thing about taking up that space that could be the space for others' voices to be kind of speaking out against this. So and I understand the argument that like, well, because I'm a person with relative social power that I should be, and that it's actually important for me to say something. And I also feel this responsibility to be creating spaces for people whose voices might not be heard in the same way. I don't know, it just starts to get complicated, but I'd love to hear any thoughts you had on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all depends on the context, right? So I know that space, but one probably shouldn't go without an invitation, for example. I mean, there is a need, just as there was in the women's movement, right, where there was and also still is a need sometimes for just women to talk to each other. There's, of course, also spaces where there's a need for people of color, for Black people, brown people, Asians, Native Americans to talk to each other. So, and those spaces, I think, are necessary, and one should probably only go there if one is invited, right? And even kind of in a larger kind of protest movement. So I do think participation there is very important, right? It's heartening and heartening, I believe, to most people really to see many of those protests out there are quite multiracial. But the agenda then needs to be set by people of color, in this case, and by African Americans, really, right? So I think, like, well, what in Germany sometimes called Black Bloc people, like, so that they should decide on their own that now this is their moment to drive a certain kind of militancy, if that's not what was being called for in the first place, right? So I do think their leadership should be left to people of color, unless they invite particular people to say, no, we want you in that space, or we want you to talk, or we're here, and so on and so forth. Then I think that's a different thing.
Yeah, I kind of like, I don't know if you've heard of the organization Surge before, SUR.
Yeah.
I like that
Yeah.
idea. So the name of that organization is Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it's designed for white people, and even in its name sort of implies an appropriate role that it's not like we shouldn't say anything or we shouldn't show up. We should show up, but showing up maybe is the most important thing we do. So it's that our presence is both a way of avoiding silence, but also trying not to take up too much space that would otherwise be and necessarily needs to be that of people of color kind of taking leadership.
Yeah. I wrestle with that. I mean, I know people in that organization and I respect them very much. There's a part of me that also thinks, I mean, we have to kind of model the world how we want it to be. And I'm taking kind of my cue there from the abolitionists, for example, right? So what were then called sort of the radical abolitionists in the 19th century. So they wrestled a lot with those questions about, and they didn't solve them. And there are lots of problems in the abolitionist movement, but it's too easy and cheap to focus on those sometimes. But what did they do, right? I mean, they traveled the country in pairs to give lectures against slavery, and in pairs of black and white. One black person, one white person,
Hmm.
because they felt that if they wanted to, and that was a much more revolutionary act in and of itself than we might realize today, right? Because that just wasn't done, So, and it would evoke a lot of anger sometimes just by even showing up like that. And there were real implications to that. It meant both of them then couldn't stay in a hotel, because it meant that the black abolitionists couldn't stay in a hotel, and then the white abolitionists would then have to say, well, okay, then I'm not going to stay in a hotel either, and so on and so forth, right? So, but they felt, that they needed to model the kind of society that they wished to create, right? So I always feel a bit ambiguous about kind of separatist organizations, and so, these are spaces for the, and so on and so forth, with a reservation of what I've said a little bit earlier, right? So, because I do think that kind of real engagement will naturally lead to relationships. And if it doesn't, then there's wrong with it somehow, somewhere, right? Because in an ultimate, you can't really be an anti-racist in the abstract, right? So that's what one theorist, Eduardo Hector Bonilla, has called kind of this, he calls it an abstract liberalism, right? Where then sort of where I am against something in principle, but the moment it actually affects me, then I'm changing my tune, because now it affects me. And so like, well, yes, I am for integrated neighborhoods than an abstract liberal would say. But at the moment people of color move into my neighborhood, then it's like, well, now I'm concerned about my property values and so on and so forth, right? So I think that the actual practice of anti-racism or anti-racism is gonna have to have also some tangible results, and those tangible results can't be siloing oneself in white environments.
And I do feel like in the white community, there are a lot of politically progressive folks that still end up being sort of abstract anti-racist, because just the definition of white privilege means that we don't really have to deal with the consequences of racism. Or in fact, we're the ones that benefit from it. So it can be harder to sort of have the incentive to really start to work toward it in a way. And I agree with you. I think what we're working toward, of course, there's a lot that we need to do with policy changes from small to large and kind of lower to higher levels in our country. But I kind of feel like that what we're moving toward is a community that is not erasing our racial, ethnic, and other sort of socially, significant lines, apparently, but instead embracing them and understanding them in the context of relationship. So a relationship to me, and in my faith as a Christian, is the sort of crucible and the space within which we are all transformed, and we learn how to mutually bless each other as we learn and understand each other, and we practice loving each other, right? So love has lost so much of its danger and of its difficulty as it's sentimentalized, I think, in this country. But at the end of the day, it is kind of the greatest adventure and challenge that we are invited into, and I think is really the tool, especially as it's practiced within community, that God gives us to try to, let's say in this case, dismantle racism, is going to happen within communities that practice in humble and imperfect ways, but hopefully in forgiving ways, loving across lines of difference. And our church, St. Luke's, is not perfect in any way in doing this, but I think it's something we aspire to, is to try to be that community, like you said, that can start to, over time, come into greater understanding of people who are experienced differently socially, and learn from them, and in the process learn a lot more about ourselves, and learn more about how we, let's say in the case of white people, maybe privileging or experiencing more benefits from our skin color by learning and hearing the stories of others, but not in like a kind of way that's just taking, right? So just kind of randomly coming up to someone who's not white and saying, hey, help me figure out what white privilege means, but instead in the context of relationship, and in more equitable ways, learning more about ourselves in the process. So that's my kind of hope and my prayer, And where I think God is most working in all this is through relationships and through communities to try to create real relationships across lines of difference, and whether it's racial or economic or otherwise.
Yes, and their real challenge also for white people is to, well, we want relationships of equals, right? And so for white people, even for well, or especially maybe for well-meaning white people, the sort of that white savior syndrome is also a difficult one to avoid, right? Where then it's white people think we are the ones who have to now solve all the problems, despite the fact, of course, the problem of racism, of course, is primarily our problem and so on and so forth, right? But there then is also, there definitely is a space for humility and listening and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, if anybody hasn't yet listened to that, what was the title of the sermon? By Bishop, that was a really powerful sermon that spoke also so eloquently to the power of love and the radicalness of love, as you just mentioned it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time that you've offered today to help all of us white folks try to figure out where we fit into all this. Anything else you'd like to add before we?
Yeah, of course. I want to say, hey, these are random throwaway thoughts. I don't really claim to possess any special kind of wisdom. It's just that I've thought about these matters for good. Now, and some of what I say then won't please everybody. But of course, I'm still trying and struggling myself, and that's a process.
Yeah. God help us. We learn this. And I think humility goes a long way, right? And kind of just recognizing how much we still have to learn, and starting from that posture.
Yes. Humility without paralysis. Yes.
That's true. Yeah. The courage to still try and then to learn from failure. Yes. All right. Well, thanks, Martin, and blessings on your day, and grateful for your time.
Thank you, Colin. Blessings to you.